Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in Leviticus chapter 13, verses 1 through 59. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. When someone has a swelling or a scab or a bright spot on the skin of his body that may become a diseased infection, he must be brought to Aaron the priest or one of his sons, the priests. The priest must then examine the infection on the skin of the body, and if the hair in the infection has turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of the body, then it is a diseased infection. So when the priest examines it, he must pronounce the person unclean. If it is a white, bright spot on the skin of his body, but it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair has not turned white, then the priest is to quarantine the person with the infection for 7 days. The priest must then examine it on the 7th day, and if, as far as he can see, the infection has stayed the same and has not spread on the skin, then the priest is to quarantine the person for another 7 days. The priest must then examine it again on the 7th day, and if the infection has faded and has not spread on the skin, then the priest is to pronounce the person clean. It is a scab, so he must wash his clothes and be clean. If, however, the scab is spreading further on the skin, after he has shown himself to the priest for his purification, then he must show himself to the priest a second time. The priest must then examine it, and if the scab has spread on the skin, then the priest is to pronounce that person unclean. It is a disease. When someone has a diseased infection, he must be brought to the priest. The priest will then examine it, and if a white swelling is on the skin, it has turned the hair white, and there is raw flesh in the swelling. It is a chronic disease on the skin of his body. So the priest is to pronounce him unclean. The priest must not merely quarantine him, for he is unclean. If, however, the disease breaks out on the skin so that the disease covers all the skin of the person with the infection, from his head to his feet, as far as the priest can see, the priest must then examine it, and if the disease covers his whole body, he is to pronounce the person with the infection clean. He has turned all white, so he is clean. But whenever raw flesh appears in it, he will be unclean. So the priest is to examine the raw flesh and pronounce him unclean. It is disease. If, however, the raw flesh once again turns white, then he must come to the priest. The priest will then examine it, and if the infection has turned white, the priest is to pronounce the person with the infection clean. He is clean. When somebody's body has a boil on its skin, and it heals, and in the place of the boil there is a white swelling or a reddish-white bright spot, he must show himself to the priest. The priest will then examine it, and if it appears to be deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white, then the priest is to pronounce the person unclean. It is a diseased infection that is broken out in the boil. If, however, the priest examines it, and there is no white hair in it, it is not deeper than the skin, and it has faded, then the priest is to quarantine him for 7 days. If it is spreading further on the skin, then the priest is to pronounce him unclean. It is an infection. But if the bright spot stays in its place and is not spread, it is the scar of the boil, so the priest is to pronounce him clean. When a body has a burn on its skin and the raw area of the burn becomes a reddish-white or white bright spot, the priest must examine it, and if the hair has turned white in the bright spot, and it appears to be deeper than the skin, it is a disease that has broken out in the burn. The priest is to pronounce the person unclean. It is a diseased infection. If, however, the priest examines it, and there is no white hair in the bright spot, it is not deeper than the skin, and it has faded, then the priest is to quarantine him for 7 days. The priest must then examine it on the 7th day, and if it is spreading further on the skin, then the priest is to pronounce him unclean. It is a diseased infection. But if the bright spot stays in its place, has not spread on the skin, and it has faded, then it is the swelling of the burn. So the priest is to pronounce him clean, because it is the scar of the burn. When a man or a woman has an infection on the head or in the beard, the priest is to examine the infection, and if it appears to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it is reddish yellow and thin, then the priest is to pronounce the person unclean. It is scald, a disease of the head or the beard. But if the priest examines the scald infection, and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest is to quarantine the person with the scald infection for 7 days. The priest must then examine the infection on the seventh day, and if the skull has not spread, there is no reddish yellow hair in it, and the skull does not appear to be deeper than the skin, then the individual is to shave himself. But he must not shave the area affected by the skull, and the priest is to quarantine the person with the skull for another 7 days. The priest must then examine the skull on the seventh day, and if the skull has not spread on the skin, and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, then the priest is to pronounce him clean, so as to wash his clothes and be clean. If, however, the skull spreads further on the skin after his purification, then the priest is to examine it. And if the skull is spread on the skin, the priest is not to search further for reddish yellow hair. The person is unclean. If, as far as the priest can see, the skull has stayed the same and black hair has sprouted in it, the skull has been healed. The person is clean, so the priest is to pronounce him clean. When a man or a woman has bright spots, white bright spots, on the skin of their body, the priest is to examine them, and if the bright spots on the skin of their body are faded white, it is a harmless rash that has broken out on the skin. The person is clean. When a man's head is bare, so that he is balding in back, he is clean. If his head is bare on the forehead, so that he is balding in front, he is clean. But if there is a reddish-white infection in the back or front bald area, it is a disease breaking out in his back or front bald area. The priest is to examine it, and if the swelling of the infection is reddish-white in the back or front bald area, like the appearance of a disease on the skin of the body, he is a diseased man. He is unclean. The priest must surely pronounce him unclean because of his infection on his head. As for the diseased person who has the infection, his clothes must be torn, the hair of his head must be unbound, he must cover his mustache, and he must call out, "Unclean, unclean." The whole time he has the infection, he will be continually unclean. He must live in isolation, and his place of residence must be outside the camp. When a garment has a diseased infection in it, whether a wool or linen garment, or in the warp or woof of the linen or the wool, or in leather or anything made of leather, if the infection in the garment or leather or warp or woof, or any article of leather is yellowish green or reddish, it is a diseased infection, and it must be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine and then quarantine the article with the infection for 7 days. He must then examine the infection on the seventh day. If the infection has spread in the garment, or in the warp, or in the woof, or in the leather, whatever the article into which the leather was made, the infection is a malignant disease. It is unclean. You must burn the garment, or the warp, or the woof, whether wool or linen, or any article of leather which is the infection in it. Because it is a malignant disease, it must be burned up in the fire. But if the priest examines it, and the infection has not spread in the garment, or in the warp, or in the woof, or in any article of leather, the priest is to command that they wash whatever has the infection and quarantine it for another 7 days. The priest must then examine it after the infection has been washed out. And if the infection has not changed its appearance, even though the infection has not spread, it is unclean. You must burn it up in the fire. It is a fungus, whether on the back side or front side of the article. But if the priest has examined it, and the infection has faded after it has been washed, he is to tear it out of the garment, or the leather, or the warp, or the woof. Then, if it still appears again in the garment, or the warp, or the woof, or in any article of leather, it is an outbreak. Whatever has the infection in it, you must burn up in the fire. But the garment, or the warp, or the woof, or any article of leather which you wash, and infection disappears from it, is to be washed a second time, and it will be clean. This is the law of the diseased infection in the garments of wool or linen, or the warp or woof, or any article of leather, for pronouncing it clean or unclean. Yeah, so one thought that was going through my head as was reading this in Leviticus 13:45. It says, "As for the diseased person who has the infection, that is an infection of the skin that's malignant, I guess, or diseased, his clothes must be torn, the hair of his head must be unbound, he must cover his mustache, and he must call out, "Unclean, unclean." The whole time he has the infection, he will be continually unclean. He must live in isolation, and his place of residence must be outside the camp. And as we're reading through the New Testament, Jesus healed at least several lepers who had this experience where they were just outside of the camp and couldn't really interact with anybody else. And if anybody came close to them, they'd have to yell out, "Unclean, unclean." Despite that, Jesus approached them and touched them and healed them. So, another instance of the unclean touching the holy and becoming clean. It's interesting. There was a sacrifice prescribed in Leviticus concerning somebody who had been healed or cleansed from their skin disease, and it was something that the priest was supposed to offer. So Jesus specifically said, "Go and get this sacrifice done. Show yourself to the priest and present the appropriate sacrifices." And I don't imagine too many people were being healed from their skin disease all the time. So I bet it was interesting at the synagogue or the temple, I guess, for the priest to start to have to offer all of these sacrifices for healing of a skin disease. Carrying forward, Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 29. Now Jesus left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue. Many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did he get these ideas? And what is this wisdom that has been given to him? What are these miracles that are done through his hands? Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are his sisters here with us?" And so they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown, and among his relatives, and in his own house." He was not able to do a miracle there, except to lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed because of their unbelief. Then he went around among the villages and taught. Jesus called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2. He gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He instructed them to take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, and to put on sandals, but not to wear 2 tunics. He said to them, "Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the area. If a place will not welcome you or listen to you as you go out from there, shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and preached that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. Now King Herod heard this, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying John the Baptizer had been raised from the dead, and because of this, miraculous powers are at work in him. Others said, "He is Elijah." Others said, "He is a prophet, like one of the prophets from the past." But when Herod heard about this, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised." For Herod himself had sent men, arrested John, and bound him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had repeatedly told Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." So Herodias nursed a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not, because Herod stood in awe of John and protected him, since he knew that John was a righteous man and holy man. When Herod heard him, he was thoroughly baffled, and yet he liked to listen to John. But a suitable day came when Herod gave a banquet on his birthday for his court officials, military commanders, and leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." He swore to her, "Whatever you ask I will give you, up to half my kingdom." So she went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask for?" Her mother said, the head of John the Baptizer. Immediately she hurried back to the king and made her request. I want the head of John the Baptist, on a platter immediately. Although it grieved the king deeply, he did not want to reject her request because of the oath and his guests. So the king sent an executioner at once to bring John's head, and he went and beheaded John in prison. He brought his head on the platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard this, they came and took his body and placed it in a tomb. Yeah, certainly wasn't all sunshine and rainbows and the ministry of John and Jesus here. You start off with Jesus preaching in his hometown, and not many people believing him on account of the fact that they saw him growing up there. And then John the Baptist was killed by Herod, particularly because of a grudge from Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he married, whom John called out the relationship as being adulterous and not legal, and they didn't like being called out, so he was killed, rather. It's crazy how being called out can elicit such a reaction here. I think that's another reason why pride is so dangerous, because it's like it doesn't accept the blame. It merely says, how dare you call me out? Off with your head. So, carrying on, Psalm 39, verses 1 through 13. I decided I will watch what I say and make sure I do not sin with my tongue. I will put a muzzle over my mouth while in the presence of an evil man. I was stone silent. I held back the urge to speak. My frustration grew. My anxiety intensified. As I thought about it, I became impatient. Finally, I spoke these words. O Lord, help me understand my mortality and the brevity of life. Let me realize how quickly my life will pass. Look, you make my days short-lived, and my lifespan is nothing from your perspective. Surely all people, even those who seem secure, are nothing but vapor. Surely people go through life as mere ghosts. Surely they accumulate worthless wealth without knowing who will eventually haul it away. But now, O Lord, upon what am I relying? You are my only hope. Deliver me from all my sins of rebellion. Do not make me the object of fools' insults. I am silent and cannot open my mouth because of what you have done. Please stop wounding me. You have almost beaten me to death. You severely discipline people for their sins. Like a moth, you slowly devour their strength. Surely all people are a mere vapor. Selah. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not ignore my sobbing, for I am dependent on you. Like one residing outside his native land, I am at your mercy, just as all my ancestors were. Turn your angry gaze away from me, so I can be happy before I pass away. What an interesting psalm. Yeah, I mean, despite the consequence for John, ultimately, Herod too and Herodias have long since passed away, comparatively shortly thereafter. I mean, I think it was Herod who was speaking, and I think it was in Acts where he was in front of this assembly, and they were saying to him, "The voice of a god and not a man," and he accepted the praise, and he was struck down because of it. So it's good for us to consider how short-lived we are. And to accumulate wealth in heaven rather than wealth on this earth. Carrying on, Proverbs 10, verse 10. The one who winks his eye causes trouble, and the one who speaks foolishness will come to ruin. Yeah, and the idea here isn't that winking is a sin in particular. It's more just the duplicitous undertones of winking. Yeah, so. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day.